Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast. Now, the pandemic highlighted what many already knew. High-speed internet access is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And yet, if we take a look around, there is still a clear digital divide. Within the US alone, 21 million citizens still lacking an internet connection. And if you zoom out and look around the world, I think it's something like 2 billion people. And even the UN Human Rights Council consider access to internet as a basic human right now. But despite numerous strides that have taken place in the technology realm, as I said, billions of people worldwide still don't have access. So how can telcos and government organisations work together to accelerate the process of identifying these digital deserts and build an infrastructure needed for internet access? Well, good news, folks. I'm a solutions, not problems kind of guy. So Dr. Mike Flaxman, head of product at Heavy AI, is going to join me on the podcast today to discuss how utilising GPU-powered advanced data analytics and visualisation can help close that digital divide and share some more. And also share a few different use cases for the kind of technology required to bring it all to life. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way stateside, where Dr. Mike Flaxman is going to talk about all this and much more. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Mike Flaxman. I'm the product manager here at Heavy AI. And my background is in general geospatial. So I've got about 25 years of experience running all kinds of geospatial projects around the world. I was in industry and academia. So I spent a good chunk of my time as a professor at MIT teaching in a planning school. And so got an opportunity to do all kinds of fun projects as a result of that. I also worked for Esri, which is one of the industry leaders in mapping. And so I have and I ran a consulting business. So I have a kind of broad base of project experience. And of course, I'm having fun being a product manager because that's the crucible of where decisions get made in software.
Love that. It's such a great career there. And I'd love to take you back right to the very beginning just for a moment. I mean, can you remember where your passion for technology came from or just a moment that would ultimately put you on the path you're on today?
No, I've always been interested both in biology and technology. And I was, for most of my early career, told you couldn't do that, right? You had to either get a CS degree or biology degree. You weren't allowed to do both. And I randomly, this has to do with journalism, but I read an article in Macworld magazine, I don't know when, quite a few decades back now. And it was about this crazy ecologist in the mountains of Southern California that was making a video disc project surveying ecosystems of the world. And I was like, hey, that guy's doing computer stuff and biology, like whatever it says I can't do. So I went, and I was actually on my way to Brazil, and I stopped by and we just hit it off instantly. And so when I came back from a year in Brazil, he hired me. And so I started working for the University of California Nature Reserve System. And that's what piqued my interest basically in the combination of biology and computer science through GIS. And so I discovered GIS right at that point. And like all great mentors, he was very helpful in getting me the next step, which in my case was graduate school. And so the rest kind of worked itself out really easily. But I didn't know that GIS existed. And I had been looking for it for, I don't know, a long time, because I just enjoyed the combination of subject matter expertise and technological expertise or just application domain stuff. And so that's why in my career, I've gone back and forth ever since. But never tell you can't do something, because you'll figure out a way to do it, even if it's some odd combination of things.
It's such a great story. And the reason I asked that question, there's always a moment or a person that just invested a little time into us and then sets us off on this whole path or journey. And of course, your path led you to Heavy AI. So can you tell me more about the story behind the company and ultimately the problems it solves with the technology?
Sure. So I had both myself and the company have roots at MIT. And so I had heard about Heavy AI under its former name while I was a professor at MIT. But it wasn't until I was running a consulting practice that I kind of had an immediate need for it. And the need was I had signed a contract with the state of Florida to do the Florida Beaches Habitat Conservation Plan. which is an enormous project with dozens of biologists, and it dealt with 800 miles of beach all over Florida and 16 different endangered species. And so we set up this contract, and typical government contract stuff, and 30-meter data was kind of the best available resolution data. So I planned everything that we're going to use 30-meter data. 5 years into the project, LIDAR came out, basically. The federal government bought LIDAR for the state of Florida, and all of a sudden we had 4-centimeter data. And I had more or less the same budget. Oh, great. How do I go with 100,000 times more data and do a good job? It seemed insane to ignore that data and stick to plan. But so anyway, that led me back to MapD at the time. I was like, oh, I remember this crazy MIT Media Lab guy and his GPU database. And so the origin from the other side is that Todd Mostak was a kind of joint political science CS student, and he was studying the Arab Spring and found that he wanted to map tweets and map social influence. And all of the existing mapping tools just broke on that volume of data. And so he rolled up his sleeves and wrote his own tool to solve his own problem. And so, we both kind of have that background of just forcing technology to our will or our need. And so we've always hit it off since then well. So I guess I was still running a company just before the pandemic. And I had a whole bunch of government contracts that I was trying to figure out how I was going to execute during the pandemic. And I was like, I really like these OmniSci guys. I should just go work for them full time. And so that's what I ended up doing. I started trying to build on the professional services side, just trying to build up a professional services practice for OmniSci. And then a couple of years into that, was getting a lot of product questions about geospatial, since that was my background. I'm kind of a subject matter expert in geospatial. And so I became the assistant product manager and eventually the product manager. So I'm an unlikely product manager because I really do not have that traditional training or background. I came at it just from a subject matter expertise, and that's the subject matter that the product most uses, basically.
Love that. And of course, fast forward to 2022, and everybody's talking about just how much the workplace has changed in the last 2 years because of the events of the pandemic. But I also recently read that the pandemic highlighted what many already suspected, and that is high-speed internet access is not actually a luxury. And I think in the US alone, 21 million Americans still lack broadband connectivity, which is just mind-blowing. But can you expand on that just to set the scene for today's conversation?
Sure. I mean, I think that our country's always struggled with, we're a big country, we've got a lot of territory. And if you go back different generations of technology, I always think about rural electrification. Like we had a situation not that long ago where a fair fraction of the population was lacking electricity. Yeah. And, because we're a far-flung country, the market only gets you so far, right? And so we've always had kind of public-private partnerships to make sure that we get the last mile and that we're able to include all of society in these major important innovations. And I do think you framed it up right. I mean, people originally thought that broadband was a luxury, that, we should all use teletype speed or something. And I guess the pandemic just put that to rest, because now every grandmother, knows how to have video conference with their grandkids. So it's been transformational in that sense. But it was always true that access was an issue. And I felt that a lot when I started teaching online. So I taught for Penn State, the World Campus. And I had a really interesting group of students in that experience, very different than I would have gotten at MIT. And they were all working professionals in far-flung areas. So that gave me the first intuition, anyway, about how important it could be to get information at high clip to remote places and be able to have, a sustainable video conversation with somebody in a rural area. So I think, to the current infrastructure bill, we have a kind of generational opportunity now in the US to finally do for broadband what we did with electrification all those years back, which is to look at it squarely from an equity point of view and make sure that we are subsidizing where we need to get infrastructure into areas that wouldn't otherwise get it, because as a country, we need everybody to have that access. And the other piece to this that I think is new on the analytics side this is a little bit of an old story. People have been trying this for at least a decade. But the efforts I'm familiar with when I was at Harvard actually stopped kind of at the census block level or census tract level. And that seemed like a reasonable thing to do because in the US, our census gets you demographics down to that level of scale. But when you think about that in a rural context, census tracts in rural areas go on for tens of miles. And the fact that like a few people in one corner of that have good service has not much to do with the fact that everybody else doesn't. And so we had a very strange system that the FCC put in place, kind of gave us the illusion that we were further ahead than we were. So it kind of hid the problem. And what I think is new in this round, at least on the analytics side, is that we now have very granular data about human activity levels all across the landscape. And so it's basically anonymized GPS traces, but it tells you kind of where population is in a way that's very helpful in figuring out both broadband and wireless service and who really gets it and do they really get it. And so we kind of need that granularity of data to be able to, to really plan the system and to really look at the equity side of it, because it's very much an issue that is scale sensitive, right? If you're just a mile away from good service, well, you're still just a mile away from good service, right?
Yeah. Although we're talking about the US there, everything that you've just said is exactly the same here in the UK. And we're a tiny, tiny country, but in rural areas, they have the exact same problem. And I suppose the big question is, how can telcos and government organisations work together to accelerate the process of identifying these almost digital deserts to build the infrastructure needed for internet access? What's the answer there? Because it seems like a big, complex problem.
It is a complex problem. And it's getting more challenging in different ways. So I guess the counterintuitive thing is new generations of cell phone technology actually carry less distance from an antenna.
Yeah.
And so traditionally those big ugly towers we all remember and some of us see still, those serve like 50,000 people with one antenna. So they're big and they're ugly, but they serve a lot of people. The new generation of technology you tend not to notice. It's clipped onto a lamppost. And it serves 50 people or maybe 500. That's because it carries less distance also, because it's lower down in the landscape and it's blocked by more buildings and trees and such. So what we've done on our end is basically to apply GPU analytics to that problem and to radically improve the efficiency of being able to map cell phone signal. So we can basically map that at 10 to 100 times faster than conventional tools. We use that to make a higher quality coverage map, and also then to as tooling for telcos that they can go in and optimize coverage, knowing where the customers actually are. So it's basically mapping supply and demand, but the granularity of the data going into this is 100 meter or less resolution, and so you're providing you're providing high bandwidth to the public library and not to the field behind it. And so it basically lets the telcos be a lot more efficient in service delivery. And that can go, within normal market forces that provides more efficient service for at least, middle density and middle class and up. But for the rest of the country, then it still can be applied, right? And so what we'd like to see is FCC and other advocacy organizations using these new tools to first of all do a better job at mapping where the service gaps exist, and then I think a lot of the technology is there already to creatively address those gaps. So it's getting cheaper and more efficient because telcos are now in this business of placing thousands of antennas, not just dozens. So they're getting better at rolling stuff out, but there's still a supply on the public library in a rural area, for instance, right? Like how do you ensure that at least critical infrastructure in those places is well served? It requires both kind of social, a number of people looking that haven't previously looked, and then these mapping tools that kind of make it open for everybody to look at. And so I think that's an important part of it, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of marginal service being provided. Yeah. And then, you get, we're providing service here. Well, yeah, but nobody can actually complete their call or their video call drops. Like, how are they going to do remote education if they can't have a stable connection? So So I think the other piece that we've learned and the telcos have learned is that there are quality of service metrics that need to evolve to your earlier point, so that the experience of doing two-way video communication has certain technical requirements, right? And it's different than basically that's high bandwidth in both directions. That's different than the GPS chip on your phone, that needs low latency, but not a lot of bandwidth so that you don't get lost because you're on the other side of the mountain. So what the telcos are doing also is to break up the kind of monolithic big service into the different tranches that are needed to support different applications. And I think that's also going to improve things because we do need different types of service in different places and different times. And so that's just a nuance in the technology that it's evolving to better serve particular applications. But there's a lot of improvement in this area just in the last 2 or 3 years. So it is an important time. And then I would say globally, crowdsourced data is available. Is a kind of fun website to look at. That way you can look at, the relative upload, download, and latency speeds for an internet service everywhere in the world. And you'll see the map is not very even, right? So it prompts anybody that thinks about policy to think about it from a policy point of view. What does that mean for a community? What does that mean for a country? But I would say the data is getting more available and the tools for addressing it are also kind of more diverse and more available.
And nobody wants a community with everyone having buffer face waiting for things to load. Nobody wants to go there. But just to bring to life some of the things we're talking about here, do you have any use cases you can share around how we can utilize GPU-powered advanced data analytics and visualization and those kind of tools just to help people understand how it can help close that digital divide?
One obvious one, because it's been in the news recently, is satellite service, right?
Yeah.
And so there are at least now 2 providers that are figuring out how to provide either complete or partial service everywhere with a regular cell phone, not requiring, some special satellite phone. So I think that's probably not on the high bandwidth side of the equation, but it certainly helps to get a message through if you got a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. So I think the number of platforms that can provide service is increasing, and you'll probably see a lot of that, rolling out across different carriers. And so I think that there will be remote service available that is more consistent, even in very rural areas, but it'll probably be lower bandwidth and more expensive ultimately. And then in urban areas, we have kind of the opposite problem. So we were talking to a telco in Japan the other day. They have antennas basically every 150 meters in downtown Tokyo. And so they have big problems with interference because they're all pumping so much signal around that everything's interfering with everything else. And similarly in Europe, I think the situation is different for telcos. So there are a lot of constraints around historic buildings and sites. And so, nobody wants a huge cell phone antenna on the top of the church, right? So there's long been a different regulatory attitude towards cell phone placement. But I guess there's now a new opportunity, and this is another technology thing, but antennas are increasingly becoming dynamic. So you're used to, the notion that they're just kind of fixed and they stay steady, but underneath the hood, they're getting more and more dynamic. And so, for instance, they might have a vantage point on a road that has evening rush hour traffic. And so they serve that during evening rush hour, but then they turn to the residential buildings at night and broadcast the signal differently. So we're starting to see basically software-defined radio is the really old term for that, but essentially the infrastructure is becoming smart. So it's responding to what's going on around it. My favorite example of this is the utilities are starting to pay attention to how much energy these antennas are taking. And basically, that can have a obvious operations benefit to them, but it has a benefit to all of us to reduce that power when it's not needed. And so it's basically like, the standby on your TV or whatever, right? But it can fall back in mode, transmit with less power if it needs to, because there's lower demand in the middle of the afternoon, and then wake up at night when it needs to. And that has pretty significant economic and energy impacts. And sitting here in California, one of the things that's really important is for us to maintain a communications network under disasters, because we've got every sort coming. And we really want our cell phone network to be reliable when we have an earthquake or a fire or a flood or a mudslide. Those are our 4 seasons. And, it's not always been the case that the cell phone network has been robust under those circumstances. And so this kind of dynamic ability to plan on the fly would let us maintain a more reliable network, including under emergency conditions, where maybe they tune down the YouTube videos, but let the emergency calls go through, right? It requires a level of sophistication in the network that hasn't existed before. It requires, hopefully, solar power to back up those systems so that they're more distributed in their power supply. And that's an exciting development, that it's can be both more energy efficient and more robust.
And before you came on the podcast today, I was doing a bit of research on you, Mike, and I read that you're the kind of guy that doesn't accept the status quo and believe that being bold and different is needed to achieve your mission. And that was the moment I thought, I've got to get this guy on here. But I've got to ask, how do you keep your curiosity and open-mindedness alive? Because it's a battle, isn't it?
It is. It's interesting. I mean, I guess I say I do a lot of reading, and I do attend a lot of conferences. So I'm taking advantage of the pandemic to attend virtual ones I might not have otherwise attended. Yeah. And I always go a little outside of my area of comfort so that I can learn something. So just went to the SIGGRAPH Computer Graphics Conference. That's what I've gone to for a few years. I'm not a computer graphics person, but I benefit from seeing what's going on there. And they're applying machine learning to computer graphics, for instance, as we do, which gives me a lot of ideas. So I think just pushing yourself a little bit outside of your domain of comfort. And I'll mention another one. So data science. I'm taking data science classes online, not because I need to practice it day to day, but because I like to keep up with what's new. And some of that makes my head hurt, right? It's beyond my level of comfort, but it's okay, right? And so I'm fine with having a level of awareness of things that I don't fully understand. And then when I need to, I can dig in and fully understand them. But I do think it's an interesting thing post-pandemic that there are a lot of educational resources available online, conferences that are now open that weren't. And so in general, I just like to challenge myself. And that's what keeps things fresh for me.
And it's so important. I read a great interview with David Bowie once, and he was saying that if you go out onto a beach and go out into the ocean, you go in just to your ankles. It's a little bit cold, but your body quickly adjusts, and you get to your knees, and it's still cold, but things are okay. And then as you go out into the ocean, it goes above your waist, still comfortable. But then when you get to the part where you're just on tiptoes, and you can just about stand up and keep your head above the water, he said that's where we should always be in life. You just push yourself to that moment where you're a little bit uncomfortable. And it's always stuck with me. And as for yourself, I also read a great article about modelling and monitoring power line vegetation management risk at scale. So can you expand on that for everyone listening that probably haven't read that article?
Sure. So that's a debate I actually do have an education in, but it took 20 years to apply. So The backstory there is I got my PhD from Harvard in fire ecology and came back to California looking for a job to apply that knowledge. And when I had started, there was a big wildfire season. There was a lot of funding around for wildfire. And when I graduated, there was no funding. And so that's why I ended up working for Esri and working in tech. And come 20 years later, the fire issue has literally gotten hot again. The whole time I've been thinking about, what I did back then. And I used to have to wait an hour to render one frame of a visualization. And so I'd plan very carefully, and then the thing would go overnight, and I'd wake up in the morning and realize I'd done something wrong. I had to start over again. But I was committed to visualizing wildfire risk. And that was kind of what I was working on the most, and getting the public to understand wildfire risk. And now we have this amazing technology 20 years later. And so it's been really fun to me to apply that for some of our utilities customers. The issue is really challenging. So I want to kind of set it up for how hard this problem is and how many resources go into it. So PG&E is our local utility here. They have 100,000 miles of line, 100,000 miles of line. And along that are 120 million trees. And it basically, what I tell people is it only takes one tree to make it a bad day, right? Because we have had fires of 1 million acres from one tree hitting one power line. So it is a hard problem at scale. And PG&E has been spending, I want to say the rough numbers are between $700 million and $1 billion a year on that problem. So it's not that there are limited, there are no resources going in. There are huge resources that go into trying to manage that. but it's a really hard problem. And so the advantage of GPU technology there is you basically need to scan through all the trees that are boring and happy and healthy and doing just fine and find the one that is struggling or about to fall over onto a line, right? And it is a 1 in a million kind of problem. But the advent of 3 technologies is converging to really help that. So we have these microsatellites going up, by the hundreds every year that are getting us better and better imagery. So it's both sharper and higher cadence. So the time when the tree starts to get sick to where it really is sick might be 2 weeks, for instance, if it's infected with beetles. You can't do anything about it 2 weeks from here, but you might be able to do something if you detect it early. So cadence is important, but so is resolution. And so there's all this tremendous amount of imagery coming in, but it would be meaningless if we had to have like humans scan through and look at all of that imagery every day. Imagine like 8 hours a day of looking at trees that are mostly healthy to find the one that's not. So it's a wonderful job for robots, and in this case, machine learning. And so the other innovation there is basically machine learning lets us pick out those unhealthy trees from millions of healthy trees. And of course, they can be in the middle of nowhere, right? So they can be in the furthest flung place you can imagine. So the solutions that we're working on with utilities have those 2 components. And then the third one that I think most people appreciate this one more is that weather forecasting keeps getting better.
Yeah.
And it's kind of amazing on the TV news. It's getting less dramatic because they're wrong less often. But we can tell, for instance, major wind events 3 or 4 days ahead of time with very high confidence. And what that lets us do is set up an adaptive response. So we might not be able to prevent the wildfire, but we can surge a bunch of resources there pre-positioned so that we've got, everything you'd want for if a disaster strikes, there are people in the right place. If it really hits and you need recovery, the right people are there for recovery. So even 3 or 4 days of notice is a huge difference. And so, there are limited things. It's a very hard situation with climate change. There are limited things we can do, but adaptation and adaptability is a big part of that. And so what excites me about what we're able to bring with GPU analytics is we can bring the correct information to more people more quickly. Just waiting hours for all of that data to download from a model when you've got a live wildfire has got to be agonizing, right? So what we're helping them to do is basically get that information in the hands of their meteorologists and their fire people much more quickly, so that as something is running, they can keep ahead of it. And if the wind shifts, they can deploy the resources better, right? And so it's not that we're doing something they're different than the traditional weather forecast. It works just like you'd expect. But if you speed it up from something that took 4 hours to something that takes 4 minutes, what you can do on the field is radically different, right? And so there's a lot of positive change in the tactics that are available there. And I think tactical wildfire fighting is obviously an important thing in California. And then the same weather models and the same infrastructure can be used for much better planning. And so it's no secret that our forests are changing. They're changing more rapidly than they ever have. And it's important for us to take that into account in management in ways we haven't had to deal with before. But ponderosa pine, for instance, is an iconic California tree, and they're growing 1,000 feet higher in elevation than they used to.
Wow.
So things are shifting uphill, which is exactly what you'd expect, from climate change. But it means that the ones that haven't moved are really stressed, right? So there's a lot that can be done in terms of more granular prescription. And I just think about it. Farmers have done this for a while now. That's called precision agriculture, right? So they're getting away from like doing one amount of watering and one amount of fertilizer for a whole field. And they're saying, oh, the north half of the field is in the sun for 2 more hours. So, we're going to change the conditions. So I think the same thing is needed in forestry and in vegetation management for utilities, that we just get a lot more spatially detailed, a lot more granular, and say, hey, this area has got, the topsoil's all eroded, the trees are stressed, but we need to pay a lot more attention there. This other area is doing well. So to get away from essentially a conventional approach that's based on routine maintenance, like every 4 years we go and revisit every tree, that's a horrible idea under climate change. So we really need to get to a risk-based approach where we have the experts looking at all of the risk information coming in and saying, how do we deploy our resources, this season, let's say in the spring, so we have a better fire season coming up, or in the moment where do we send people? But to me, it has a lot to do with the timeliness and the granularity of the information. But it's a hard organizational change, right? Not to underestimate it. You need people to look at all this stuff, right? And you need adaptive capacity requires people to be able to do at least the high level decisions about, we're not just following a schedule. Now somebody needs to decide where we're going. Right? So there's a lot more institutional change that needs to happen. I think we're good on the IT side, right? If we just deploy the current IT that we've got, we've got decades of improvements just on if technology stood still. So we're not limited by the information thanks to these microsatellites and all the machine learning. Like, we can get the information. Now the question is, how do we change our institutions so that they are more responsive, in the case of utilities, to risk for sure, and do so in a way that doesn't break the bank. And so, $700 million, it's a lot of ratepayer money to be spending on vegetation management. So I think, at least all in Northern California, we're all pretty interested that they get more efficient about how they're doing that job, not just that they throw more money at it, because ultimately it's our money they're throwing at it. So but there's a lot of room for improvement there, but it includes kind of business process reengineering behind the scenes to be able to respond to all of that more detailed information coming at them.
100%. And if we look at ourselves here, there's 5,000 miles or over 5,000 miles between us. But if either one of us put on the TV, picked up a newspaper or scrolled down our news feeds, we'll see a lot of depressing things there about the climate crisis, global conflict, the unfairness in society. There's just so much going on at the moment. And there's a lot of uncertainty. But I'm curious, what makes you hopeful about the future, and of course the role that technology will play in making the world a better, fairer place for all, because that's the place we need to get to, right?
It is, and it's classic that it doesn't make the news, but there are indeed a lot of improvements here. Yeah, and so I think the very fact that we're talking about social equity and internet access is important, right? Because if you don't think about the issue, then you don't start to measure it, and you can't resolve it. And so we're at least at the point of thinking about these things and measuring them. Humans are clever. Like I am optimistic about us as a species from that point of view. We may be a little myopic, but when we really see a problem, we really start to recognize it. We do mobilize. And so, for all of these problems, there's a lot to be done, at least in adaptation. And I think it can be done more efficiently, more effectively than ever before. So I am optimistic on that front. And that's what keeps me with analytics, I guess. Maybe I have an analytics bias, but I do think if we measure these things and honestly look at them, we have the ability to change how we manage things. And it's interesting, right? The stuff that used to be far-flung and hard, like the tree in the middle of the forest, literally, like that's no longer hard. I mean, it's hard for us to think about that it's changed so much that we can see that tree how it was yesterday, right? So we're getting used to Zoom and doing interviews across the planet. Yeah. But similar technology is really important to being able to observe things that are important, even if they're at distance. And what used to be impossibly expensive to monitor has become trivial to monitor, right? So there's a lot of this that's mindset. And that's, I guess, the part that makes me optimistic, because I know that once people pick up on the fact, I can do that affordably, it's quite reasonable. Yeah, it's not in my job description. My last predecessor didn't do it, but 20 years ago, this was really expensive, was really hard. Now it's, so the thing that's interesting with this level of technology change and the convergence is that there are just a lot of opportunities. So that part makes me optimistic that people will combine those pieces and at least we'll have a better picture of what's going on and the capacity to respond. And hopefully, that's why I always like BBC nature films, right? Yeah. Just being able to see what's going on, even on the other side of the world. It's knowledge is the first part of caring. And so I think as we see more of what's going on, we can get motivated to act. And socially, there's a lot of things we can do.
Well, we started the podcast talking about your origin story, and as we've come full circle, and I'm going to ask you to leave us with a gift now, and that is a book that maybe inspired you or you've read recently that listeners might want to pick up that you'd recommend that would add to our Amazon wish list. But what would that book be and why?
So the book would be Ian McHarg's Design with Nature, which I first read in college. And, people are brilliant when they think of an idea that, only gets implemented 30 years later. And so basically, this is one of these books. Don't remember the exact publication date, but I want to say it's 1970s. This Scottish forester, actually, I think is his origin, moved to the US and became a landscape architect and a great communicator, science communicator. But he came up with a system for using maps and visualizations for planning. And he was able to use that to understand very early on how to do ecological design. So basically not put houses in places that are going to flood or going to have earthquake damage, et cetera, et cetera. And the method he came up with was all pencil and paper and light table, actually, at the time. And it's actually the core to what we have done now for 30 years, 40 years in GIS. And it's still stuff we use on our fancy GPU accelerated analytics today. So I recommend it to people both for the interesting kind of, the guy is a kind of, Da Vinci style polyglot. Like he knows a bunch about a bunch of stuff from lithology to vegetation. So it's just interesting the way he saw the world, all these different layers of information. But to me, then how he combined that. So how he combined knowing where the bedrock was with where you might want to put a house or not. And so I guess the reason I like it is that there are a lot of specialized scientific texts around on all those topic areas, and those are easy to find. Very hard to find synthetic methods. And we have a paradox in the world, right? As we get more and more people more narrowly expert in everything, then how do you bring it back together and still make a decent decision? And so he came up with one method that works for spatial data quite well. And he was just a wonderful storyteller. So it's a very good read, even for people that don't normally read science. I would recommend it. So anyway, that was influential to me. Again, kind of abstracted of technology, but also because I realized immediately that the technology I was using was based essentially on his ideas. I could go back to his ideas and figure out what else we could do, right? So anyway, there's it's a big topic, right? Design with nature, but I think that's a very foundational book that if people haven't seen it, they should.
Wow, what an incredibly cool choice. And I love that as well. I mean, it came from this guy's ideas and how people are now taking it a step further with technology. So I'll get that added to our Amazon wish list. But for anyone listening that would just love to dig a little bit deeper on anything we talked about today, want to find out more about heavy AI, or even contact your team, what's the best starting point for everything?
Sure. Well, we've got a fairly comprehensive website and it has live demos on it. And so the fun thing you can do is actually play with the interactive demos. So you don't just need to read marketing copy. You can actually get your hands on and play with something. And so I think that's probably the best way to get started. There are also kind of downloads of white papers and case studies. So if you have a particular area you're interested in, how this applies to utilities, we have a white paper on that. So if you want to go a little deeper, we have those resources available. But I would urge people to kick the tires and look up top. I think the general email is just info@heavy.ai. So feel free to contact us. We also have kind of, mailing lists and things more specific on the technology. If people, I should have mentioned up front, there's a free download available. So if you want to try this yourself, you can basically download a pretty generous free edition that I believe goes up to 500 million rows of data, which is an order of magnitude more than traditional GIS can handle. So if you are in the position of having, big geodata that you want to grok, by all means, download the free software and try it. Or if you want even bigger than that, contact basically our enterprise teams. They help big enterprises like utilities.
Well, I'll add all the links to everything you mentioned there to make that easy for people to find as well. And as you said very early on, despite numerous strides that have taken place in the technology realm, and we all get a bit self-congratulatory on that, over the last 2 decades, billions of people worldwide still don't have access to the internet. So food for thought. But more than anything, just thank you for sharing your story with me today. I really appreciate your time, Mike.
Great. It was a pleasure talking to you.
So a big thank you to Dr. Mike for highlighting the fact that despite numerous strides and leap forwards taking place in the world of tech, billions of people still don't have access to the internet in the world. So it's great to hear about the work he's doing there and how they're attempting to narrow that digital divide. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything we talked about today, because I know you're all listening out there in 165 different countries, not just the UK and the US. So you've heard from me, you've heard from Dr. Mike. Now I want to hear from you. So email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok @NeilCHughes, and my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. But that's it for today's episode. So a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.